All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We try to check out great theories and earth-shattering discoveries and grand unified theories, magnum opuses, and tour de forces, generally from obscure sources and things that you probably haven't heard of, but if you had, or when you do, they would affect your life in profound ways. And we've been doing a long series of Bible decodes. It's number 218. And we've been exploring a lot of the Roman origins hypothesis. Many authors have suggested that the New Testament was written by the Romans. There's an immense amount of evidence for this compared to the zero evidence for the apostles having written the Gospels. All of the evidence that corresponds, corroborates the existence of Jesus is Roman. And so if you posit that the Roman Caesars, in particular of the Flavian dynasty from 69 to 96 AD, which included Emperor Vespasian and his son Emperor Titus, if you posit that the New Testament was a psychological operation, a weapon of war against the Jews. Romans had just gotten done fighting one war against the Jews from 66 to 73 AD, but really a series of battles and revolts and insurrections and riots that went back over 100 years. And so the Romans were trying to mellow out the Jews, to tame the Jews, or to domesticate them, and also to mock them and belittle them and ridicule them, and also to secretly get them to worship the Caesars without knowing it, and then possibly also to eliminate the real Jesus from history. The real Jesus was just a human being like all of us, but one that revolted and tried to take the throne of Rome when it was wide open there after the assassination of Nero. Eventually, Vespasian is named the new emperor, but not until after 3 separate emperors were named and assassinated in the course of 12 months. And this guy, King Esus of Edessa, may have been another person in line for the throne that the Romans captured and executed. And somehow he survived his execution, apparently. But anyway, the evidence, that's the motive. The Romans also had the means and the opportunity. They were the only people who had the means and the opportunity. They also had the MO. They created a number of other religions, but mostly it has to do with all the correspondences between the New Testament and a work from Josephus named War of the Jews. There's a history of this war between the Romans and the Jews. And Josephus, according to his autobiography, was a member by adoption of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, of Vespasian and Titus. He lived at a townhouse at Caesar's palace. He was one of the court historians, and he had the firm endorsement of Titus for this book, of which Titus and Vespasian were 2 of the protagonists. But if you look at War of the Jews, you will see, if you know how and where to look, you will see so many different parallels between the 2 stories that there is no way that they could have been written by different hands. Now, I don't necessarily believe that Josephus was just one person. I think maybe Josephus was like the editor of a much larger operation, because this operation is so detailed, so intricate, and so devious that I don't think that one person could have done it. But maybe Josephus was just the figurehead of a much larger operation. A few other scholars think that it was this guy named Arius Piso who wrote under the name of Josephus, as well as many other names. And his whole family, it was kind of like the family business to publish these classical works in really all fields, including this guy named Hero of Alexandria, who was an inventor, Claudius Ptolemy, the astronomer / astrologer, possibly even Aristotle, as a kind of backdating his work. And that's what they did with the Gospels as well. They backdated the work by 40 years and made it so that many of Jesus's prophecies were fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews, along with Jesus's military, Jesus's ministry is exactly the same as Titus's military campaign. Every place that they go, one goes, the other goes, in the same order, and they each encounter parallel events. And then if you look into the book of Luke, there are well over 250 parallels to War of the Jews just in Luke, meaning that the book of Luke is thoroughly saturated with parallels. And some of them are, like I said, incredibly well hidden, but detailed and intricate and well thought out and quite evil as well. Mocking and ridiculing, usually very cold, grim, brutal, all of it. Absolutely no chance that any of it is coincidental. I mean, maybe some of it is coincidental, but not all of it. You can maybe dismiss 5 of them for being coincidental, but not 250 of them. And then Menescot's also the author of this book, Christianity's Origins, that just came out last year. He graphs all 250 of these parallels on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and the War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, and plots a point wherever there's a correspondence. The points make 5 perfect, near perfect letters in Latin, APTVS. Maybe Arius Piso Titus Vespasianus, or something with Titus and Vespasian in it. Regardless, the main point is that the Romans actually signed their names or put their initials on the book of Luke, so that you would be very clear what they did when you discovered their sinister plot, which they wanted to be discovered, just not in their lifetimes. They wanted to be known for doing this. And unfortunately for them, I guess, the joke has gone on for almost 2,000 years now, and hardly anybody has figured it out. Until now. Now, we are reading from a book that's kind of gets almost into the Roman origins hypothesis, but not quite. And they stop short. They recognize all the pro-Roman things that are done in the New Testament, especially from Paul. But Jesus is almost as pro-Roman as Paul is. And Jesus is almost as anti-Jew as Paul is, according to their actions throughout the Gospels. Jesus never does anything non-deferential to the Romans. But at the same time, he's constantly disrupting the various rituals of the Jews. And Paul is even more pronounced. So they focus in their book Operation Messiah. This is the authors Thies Voskelin and Rosemary Sheldon. And they focus in the book on Paul. Operation Messiah, their hypothesis is that Paul was a secret agent of the Romans. So they're recognizing the Roman origins, but not the complete Roman origins. They just put it on Paul, but not on Jesus. So the Gospels are legit, but the epistles are not, is kind of where they are with it. Paul came in later. The whole thing was clean up until the time that Paul came in. Whereas if you just have the Roman origins hypothesis, that you can just say the whole thing was an op from the start, and the whole thing is fiction, including all of Paul's behavior. Okay, I think we are about to start a section in chapter 5. Chapter 5 is about Paul's conversion or calling experience that he has at Damascus, where Jesus overtakes him in spirit and asks him why he's persecuting him. And Paul is overcome and blinded for 3 days or something, and then is converted and then preaches nonstop. But before that, he was a Roman agent. And so do you not think that his co-agents, what did they just let him defect and go over to the other side, and all of a sudden they're trying to persecute him? Or how did that work? But right now we're in a section where they're kind of trying to give you the lay of the land in terms of all the Herods. The Herods were the client kings of Judea that worked for Rome, but they had Jewish blood, and there were many of them. Not just King Herod the Great, but his son Archelaus, and then there's Philip, and there's Antipas, and there's Agrippa, and many others. And they all intermarried. They married their cousins, and then they got divorced and married their brother's cousin or whatever. And so it's super hard to keep track of all these Herods. But this is a section that's called Antipas Exiled. So Antipas was one of the Herods in about the mid-1st century. Back in Tiberias, Herodias. This is about Herodias is the one that wanted the daughter wanted John the Baptist's head on a platter or whatever. So back in Tiberias, Herodias thought the Romans should give the royal title back to her husband, Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. And she hatched a plot to make Antipas king. Caligula did not agree, the emperor, and exiled Antipas to Lyon in Gaul on evidence brought by his nephew and brother-in-law, Herod Agrippa. So he's his nephew and his brother-in-law. Herod Agrippa I was thereafter. That's too complicated. Like, it's hard for me to even, hurts my head to think about all those things. Herod Agrippa I was thereafter rewarded with Philip's tetrarchy. The Nabatean, and these Nabateans, these are Arabs. The Nabatean recapture of Damascus under Aretas IV lasted for a relatively short time, perhaps less than a year, and thus the absence of coinage attesting to this event is not very disturbing. It seems that Aretas still maintained this control at the time of Saul's escape from the city through the Nabatean ethnarch he had appointed. Once it became known that the Roman Emperor Tiberius had instructed the governor of Syria to launch an expedition against the Nabateans, Aretas was probably relinquished his new territory quickly. A confrontation with Roman forces was certainly not in the Nabateans' best interest, and operations on two fronts, in the north and in the vicinity of Petra, would have not been prudent. What was Saul's role in this? Josephus claims that the Jewish crowd took Antipas's defeat by Aretas IV as retribution for what Antipas had done to John the Baptist. It has been suggested that Saul was involved in this conflict, and we agree. Saul, already in Damascus on a mission, may have gone to the Nabatean kingdom to spy on Aretas for the Herodians, the ruling elite of the system of government in Palestine installed by the Romans. He would obviously be on Antipas's side, not the Nabateans. In Nabatea, Saul may have become known as a Herodian agent and, by association, a Roman sympathizer or even a Roman agent. Escaping back to Damascus from a brief stay in Nabatea would not have freed him from Aretas's grasp. No sooner did he arrive there than Aretas's police chief, the ethnarch, tried to arrest him. The change in jurisdiction had not lasted long, but it was prudent for Saul to get out of town for the time being. By his own testimony in 2 Corinthians 11:3, he became a fugitive from the representatives of Aretas, not the Jews, as portrayed in Acts, which says that it was the Jews who objected to Saul's advocacy of the messiahship of Jesus. Well, that's interesting. So in this case, Paul's epistles are slightly less pro-Roman than what is portrayed in Acts. Now, Acts is kind of written by Paul as well, because it apparently, according to scholars, was written by Luke. And Paul was kind of Luke's informant, both for Luke's gospel and for Acts. But anyway, Acts kind of says that Paul was kind of battling against the Jews, whereas 2 Corinthians says he was a fugitive from Aretas. Okay, if King Aretas was looking for Saul in Damascus, it would have been because he was guilty of some political crime. The king may have discovered that Saul was a former agent of the high priest of Jerusalem, a Herodian partisan, or a Roman agent, and that he was in Damascus on a mission in a region that now fell under Nabatean sovereignty. Had Saul been questioned by the authorities and claimed he gave up his mission because of his conversion, they probably would not have accepted the cover story. Saul had to depart swiftly, so down in the basket he went. This section is called Rewriting the Story. All this political backdrop is subsumed in Acts 9:24 into an escape because the Jews were plotting to kill Saul. This was supposedly in retribution for Saul's fearlessly proclaiming his doctrine of Christ, quote, in the synagogues at Damascus. That's Acts 9:20. The first problem with this story is that there were probably not many synagogues in the city we know now as Damascus. Acts constantly inverts accusations made against Roman or Herodian officials, not only with the execution of John the Baptist and crucifixion of Jesus, but now with the quarrel between Aretas IV and Herod Antipas. Acts constantly inverts accusations made against Roman or Herodian officials. Inverts accusations. It seems maybe diverts. Yet this is the true background to Saul's escape down the walls of Damascus in a basket, unless we believe Saul escaped twice from Damascus in baskets, which seems unlikely. This does not rule out the possibility of Jewish involvement in Saul's escape from Damascus. Acts 9:23 speaks of a Jewish conspiracy against Saul's life. But it is not the Jews in synagogues who are aggressively anti-Saul. It is the Nazarenes, the very people he had come to arrest. Right. Nazarenes were the group that was led by James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter. But they went way back into Old Testament times, and they were just very, very, very strict, especially with the rituals. Some of these men were much too intelligent to be taken in by the new Saul cover story. They did not like the message he is preaching, and they did not believe he had received any call. If Saul's mission was to provoke and divide the Jesus movement, he was succeeding brilliantly. One indication of this was the remarkable behavior that his fellow agents kept on displaying. Saul's fellow persecutors continued to keep their distance, while he was spreading his own version of the Messianic message and causing havoc among the very same Nazarenes he had come to persecute. The Nazarenes may have been incensed to the point of resorting to armed violence. Acts depicts these people as ordinary Jews, as opposed to militant members of the Jesus movement. It would be difficult, however, to think of another group of Jews having so big a problem with Saul that they were willing to commit murder. Acts 9 shows us that Saul's fellow agents might not have been totally ignorant of the events as they unfolded. From this passage, it can be deduced that the anonymous followers who came to Saul's rescue were his own men, since Acts puts them in contrast to, quote, the Jews, meaning Nazarenes. For various reasons, it seems more likely that these rescuers were Saul's fellow police agents who intervened to bring their provocateur to safety in the face of Nazarene assassination attempts. Acts states that day and night the Jews in Damascus kept close watch on the city gates in an operation that was designed to kill Saul. This implies a sizable and organized clandestine assassination effort by a group of highly motivated people. If these assassins were Nazarenes, who by that time had survived a considerable amount of persecution, it seems reasonable to assume that they had gained some experience in clandestine activities. On the other side, Saul's agents would have been trained and prepared to carry out a rescue operation in the face of such enemy hostility. A hastily organized group of untrained and inexperienced civilians, however, would not. Rescuing Saul would require a trained eye to identify possible surveillance teams, as well as the non-uniformed assassins who were waiting for him in the hustle near the city gates. The rest of the operation would involve getting Saul past these assassins unnoticed and preparing a clean getaway for the rescuers themselves. The intervention by Saul's colleagues would explain the team's remarkably passive behavior up to this point. They had simply been waiting for the most aggressive and dangerous messianists to be flushed out, provoked into doing something by their own provocateur Paul. A deception operation involving Saul as a, I keep saying Paul, they keep saying Saul. So I think you get the idea. They're continuing to call him Saul, I guess, because he never really did get converted, and he is faking the conversion. So he's still Saul to them. A deception operation involving Saul as a provocateur and the rest of the team functioning as bodyguards on standby seems to be a plausible, rational explanation for the passive behavior of the team of fellow agents while in Damascus. We also do not know if any Romans were involved in the extraction. We are suggesting that when Acts says his followers took him by night and lowered him out of the city in a basket through an opening in the wall, this refers to the original team of agents who had delivered him there in the first place. Sounds like a lot of drama, and sounds like the Roman origins hypothesis. The whole thing is fiction, and it was all written by Josephus, or whoever, Team Josephus. Perhaps they had not disappeared, but stayed in Damascus as a security measure for Saul's safety. His fellow persecutors had never had any reason to worry about Saul's loyalty because they were all in on the operation. Why else would they tolerate his behavior to begin with? There was never any danger that Saul would share secret information with the Nazarenes. Quite the contrary, he was in a position to pass along information about the Nazarenes to his fellow agents for transmission back to the high priest in Jerusalem or to the Romans. Saul's behavior fits the profile of an agent who kept on undermining his original victims and whose loyalty remained with the government, not with the dissidents. This section is called the New Interpretation of the Damascus Event. From a psychological viewpoint, an undercover operation seems to be a somewhat more realistic scenario than one in which experienced government agent suddenly tosses aside his previous sworn religious and political loyalties and changes his complex set of convictions to the polar opposite of the political and the spiritual spectrum. It would also be a persuasive and rational explanation for the extremely passive stance of his fellow police agents. From a strategic viewpoint, moreover, a deception operation involving Saul as a provocateur seems a more likely scenario than one in which an entire team of trained persecutors stands by idly, while Saul deserts right under their very noses to the enemy. This would be a very bizarre twist in the course of events, and it involves an incredible degree of irrational, if not outright dim-witted behavior on behalf of these professional persecutors. Acts gives another strong clue that Saul might have faked his alleged conversion, which is, of course, a religious term for what the government would have called a desertion. Whatever their professional duties may have required, the authorities never once accused Saul of desertion, never had any trouble snatching him back from the Messianist movement, and never tried to stop him from leaking sensitive information to the enemy. In a normal desertion situation, they would have taken measures to punish such desertion. According to Acts, however, they did not. If their former agent was giving them inside information on the persecuted movement he had joined, however, the scenario makes perfect sense. In the following years, there is little indication that the high priest or the Romans were after Saul for his desertion. In Acts, it is only the Jews who are constantly trying to kill him for reasons of blasphemy, but not because he had betrayed the high priest. Had persecutor Saul really deserted, it seems likely that the Jewish authorities would have at least accused him of desertion. Even if they thought Saul was beyond retrieving, they still could have made an example of him in order to stress that no one was allowed to leave government circles and join the enemy. It seems clear that what we now have is an agent provocateur chased out of Damascus by his intended victims. Saul, perhaps in the pay of the Romans, set off looking for opportunities to create havoc among the Nazarenes. In keeping with Roman aims, his plan was to short-circuit their nationalistic tendencies and spread a message to the world that Jesus was not a political nationalistic Messiah, but rather that he was a peace-loving Savior, not for the Jews, but for all. Saul would have to discover just the right identity, message, and audience to whom to sell this new interpretation. That's the end of the chapter. But see, the problem that I have, at least with that, is that it's not, he says, in keeping with Roman aims, his plan was to short-circuit their nationalistic tendencies and spread a message to the world that Jesus was not a political nationalistic Messiah, but rather that he was a peace-loving Savior. But Paul doesn't need to spread that message because it's right there in the Gospels. Jesus is a peace-loving Savior in the Gospels. So if Paul were to do that, it would be just consistent with Jesus's behavior in the Gospels. That's why they need to expand their scope and recognize that the operation is much bigger than what they're saying. It's not just Paul as a secret agent. It is that Paul, along with every other thing in the Gospels, is a secret agent because it is all a psychological operation and the whole thing is fiction. So all of the characters are there in order to basically mellow out the Jews and tame the Jews and shame the Jews. Okay, now just kind of have to scroll through quite a few pages of footnotes here, and we can at least start chapter 6, which is called